Good afternoon. Welcome to the Conversations program. If you're just joining us, my name is Colleen Milliard. I'm Art Basel's executive editor, and it's my immense pleasure to welcome you all to this panel entitled Adaptive Architecture, Art and Cultural Memory, a panel that we've put together in collaboration with our partners at the Uzbekistan Art and Culture and Development Foundation. On stage, we have a really eminent roster of speakers. Gayane Umerova, who is the chairperson at the Uzbekistan Art and Cultural Development Foundation in Tashkent. We've got artists Muhannad Shono and Shokhrukh Rakhimov. And the talk is going to be moderated by my longtime friend, Dr. Sara Raza, who is the Artistic Director and Chief Curator at the Center for Contemporary Arts in Tashkent, opening this fall. So please join me in giving them all a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Colleen, for that very kind and warm welcome. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for being here. It's my great pleasure to be joined here with my colleagues to undertake this talk on adaptive architecture, public art, and cultural memory. And I'd like to just firstly introduce my colleagues first. To my right is Gayane Umerova, the chairperson of the Art and Cultural Development Foundation in Uzbekistan. She is responsible for spearheading all cultural initiatives, not just in Tashkent, where I am working at the Center of Contemporary Art, but also across the entire country. So I'm very happy that you're here with us. Also, we have Muhannad Shono, artist from Saudi Arabia, who's currently in resident at the Center of Contemporary Art Residencies in Tashkent, and he'll be speaking a little bit about that today. And last but not least, we have Shokhrukh Rakhimov, an artist of great esteem, Tashkent-based artist, who is part of a 7th generation of potters in Uzbekistan, a great family legacy who have their own cultural legacy of their own. And I'd just like to frame our talk before we begin and sort of give you a little bit of context into Tashkent, which is the capital city of Uzbekistan, where the Center of Contemporary Arts is due to open in September of this year, and we look forward to welcome all of you. And it is a sort of prelude, will be also the Bharbaniel in the city of Bukhara, also in September. But Tashkent is a city of great renaissance. It is a city that has been active since the period of antiquity, all the way to the contemporary period. And it has gone through different changes of changing of hands of different ruling elites, but also architectural sort of changes. And in the 20th century, part of the legacy of Tashkent was a suite of buildings that were erected by the Soviets. Tashkent suffered a sort of a devastating earthquake in the 1960s, and much of the city was then rebuilt, including museums, cultural monuments, metro stations, and so forth. And the Center of Contemporary Arts, as part of that environment, was a former tram depot and diesel station, which is being renovated in the last phase now by Studio KO, who are a Paris and Marrakesh-based architectural bureau. And Gayane will be speaking a little bit more in a forthcoming regarding how they sort of came to being, how that project came to light. And so Tashkent is sort of really the nucleus where all the sort of headquarters happens, our offices are there, and it's sort of a cultural sort of center. But as I mentioned, we have also other pockets, Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, and Gayane will speak to that later as well in terms of her sort of strategy and planning. And what is sort of really important for us to sort of state is that CCA is part of a network with CCA residencies. And the residencies are sort of a prelude to how our center is going to sort of function. And they opened in January of this year. 2 sites. One is a former madrasa and mosque, and the other one was a former kindergarten. Both were sort of left abandoned for several years, and then we sort of worked with Studio KO to sort of renovate and reconstruct and rethink. So a lot of the work is about restoration and repair. There's a great deal of care for the community and thinking about what does it look like for architecture to be adapted in a way that takes into consideration care, repair, and restoration. So that's sort of really key to the work that we have been undertaking, and particularly under Gayane's guidance. So I'd like to first start by asking Gayane about the sort of wider cultural sort of plan that you have in place. As a native resident of Tashkent, you were born there, you have lived there for the majority of your life, and thinking about this sort of rethinking architectural plans, rethinking buildings that were left abandoned after the fall of the Soviet Union, and sort of adapting them to the flow and ebb of today's society. So Gayane, perhaps you can start by talking about your own sort of plan in invigorating the architecture.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm also very privileged to be part of this conversation today. So I'll start by saying that at the foundation for me and my team, culture means bringing life into the existing buildings that we inherited from the past. It means revitalizing, redesigning those buildings for the next generations. And it's crucially important for these stories to be told of this building, but also to evolve with the new stories and to create a new story and the new concepts. And you've been just mentioning the Center for Contemporary Art, which is a former diesel station, which we discovered in 1918 as a structure that was squeezed between 4 universities. And I think this is why we felt very attracted to this building, because the 4 universities already created infrastructure for us and like an ecosystem for students to be around. So we felt the need to restore this building. And of course, the first idea that came to our mind is to create a Center for Contemporary Art, which at that time was not existed in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent especially. And we started to rethinking this building, how it should look like, because it was a great state. It was a great building of 1912, of Russian Empire building, which meant that the core of the building was really in good condition. It was all made of brick. And since then, we started to carefully look at the building. And I remember that you was part of the exhibitions that we launched first, already in existing place in 2019. Yes. It was like a pioneer inauguration exhibition. At that time, we was already in the process of selecting an architect. And once we discovered that we really want to save the building in the current condition and to restore the building and to restore the beautiful bricks that you just see on the screen, we invited Studio Kaol from France. And at that time, they already created a building in Marrakesh, the beautiful Museum of Yves Saint Laurent, where it was a museum built from scratch, but they was using the legacy of Marrakesh and Morocco itself to create a new infrastructure. And I found that very beneficial also for our structure. And we started working together from 2021, creating the buildings that will be a new hub for the students, for the younger generation, but also for people who admire art and who want to learn more. And this is not the only example at the foundation that we have. Since 7 or 8 years, we're already working a lot with the modernist architecture, revitalizing majority of the buildings that we inherited in Tashkent. We also work with buildings in Bukhara, converting the mosque and madrasas, which are currently abandoned, as Uzbekistan found a base as a secular state. And these buildings are no longer in use, but we are bringing the new culture and the new life to this building, creating a Bukhara biennial. And majority of the buildings that we are working, we are trying to redesign them and to revitalize.
Absolutely. And, the great deal of cultural sensitivity has gone into your work. You have, for example, the residencies are located in more traditional neighborhood known as the mahalla, and you have really invited and embraced the local community in that also.
Yeah, well, the art residencies is a great example. We was in the process of the project with our dear architect Christian Gantenbein, the Swiss architect from Basel, when we was working with them on our first national pavilion in Venice. And that's how we discovered that the majority of the buildings in old mahalla, old part of the Tashkent city, will be demolished. And we found this beautiful mosque and madrasa, and also on the other roads, like over those buildings, the old kindergarten, and we decided to preserve it and to convert it into the art residency.
Absolutely, and similarly, when I visited you in 2019 is when I first visited CCA, and Gayane had organized an exhibition of Saodat Osmalova, and we also congratulate her on her Art Basel award, and that was the sort of first instance where she had a sort of an early career retrospective of video works, and the space was then in its sort of raw format. And I remember you took me on a tour through the different labyrinths. And now, as it's sort of under renovation, it is still embracing many of the original features, but also adding new elements, making the space more accessible, inclusive, but also one of the most beautiful features, and maybe you have seen in the sort of looping videos, is that the architects chose 5 types of stone from across Uzbekistan, and they really went over the country to add elements from all over Uzbekistan to sort of add this sort of dimension to the space. So you have both the contemporary art sort of aspect, but you also have a deep sense of cultural sort of rootedness and sensitivity. We have a very young population in Uzbekistan, 70% is under the age of 30, and we're right next door to a university, an international branch of Westminster University. So we're really going to be this sort of hub for this next generation to be part of the dialogue and exchange. And coming back to the residencies, as Muhannad has been in residence for the last 1 month or so in Tashkent, based in the Khas Tamam complex, which was a former kindergarten. Gayane mentioned that 10 years or so it was left sort of abandoned, and you have been sort of ideating there, thinking about sort of a unique topography of Tashkent. Please share with us your experience.
Well, I think when we think of the role of repurposing architecture, I often think of the idea that, when buildings die, and by that I mean not their demise, their disintegration, their loss, but more the narratives that have given shape to this architecture, to the form and the ritual function of these spaces. When that goes through a transmutation, a change, what happens to these spaces, to the architecture that's left behind? When we think of religious institutions, when we think of political institutions, social or cultural institutions, sometimes these buildings, when they are in the midst of change, they can resist the change, they can delay it, and it's important for us to be able to very quickly breathe life back into this architecture, to reimagine its use, its narrative. An interesting thing about, for example, Saudi Arabia, is we import our desert sand for concrete construction from, not from our local desert, which is the grain of sand formed by the wind. We actually import sand from places like Australia and Spain. There's something really poetic about our landscape, saying that we need to embrace a more fluid state and not allow narratives to create architecture that becomes rigid, that becomes entrenched, that refuses to change. So when you're sitting on a dune overlooking a landscape of change, if you're not able to have a reference point, which is sometimes this architecture, which can act as a liminal space, a transformative space, a gateway from these forgotten architecture, if we can breathe narrative back into them, they can allow us to understand, to perceive the change that we are experiencing all around us. And there's both Saudi Arabia and Tashkent are both, and Uzbekistan, are both experiencing a very transformative, rapid development culturally, socially, economically. And if we forget these structures and do not bring them with us in this act of change and transformation, then the moment of change can be forgotten and can be rendered invisible.
Yes, absolutely. And when the residencies were set up, one of the things that Gayane mentioned to me is that they were initiated as a thinking space to sort of readapt, and why the architecture was so significant. Obviously, it's had different functions, different public roles, but then imbued with the artist sort of experience, and particularly your experience, because it has a very distinctive brick, which, as Gayane mentioned, is the imperial brick known as Nikolai brick, which is a reference to the former Russian monarch. And you sort of see that all across Uzbekistan, but it's also part of the legacy of historical buildings as well, had a very similar visual identity. And when the residency was sort of thought through, and especially where you are staying, it's more of a thinking space. It's sort of, you're adding your own sort of dimension of memory, cultural sort of interaction and so forth. But the sister site residency is also a lab where we invite the public, to, particularly the artist public, to sort of make use of materials, facilities and so forth. So it's also this active process. It's not something that's happening in a silo. The public is very much engaged. The fact that the doors are always open, people can always come through. There's a coffee shop, there's a relaxing space, there are various seating structures. So the door is always open and welcome in that sense. You are right to say that we are also part of a sort of global south invigorating process where much change is happening, driven by culture. But in Uzbekistan, there's obviously different history, a different geography, different topography as well, in terms of how culture has sort of unfolded over different chapters of history. But in terms of, may I ask you one question regarding your residency in particular? You have been sort of researching and working with local scientists, and I don't know how much you can reveal about your forthcoming project, but it has been a sort of very collaborative affair.
I've been spending some time at the Institute of the Sun in Uzbekistan, and outside Tashkent, which was the feature of the Venice Biennale this year for the National Pavilion of Uzbekistan. And it is a former Soviet institution, a solar furnace that, again, carries so much potential, and both as a connector between memory and visions of the future. So we're looking at new materials that can be developed, and how can we link through architecture the narratives of the past with our imagined collective future.
Absolutely, I think that's sort of really important, and that is the sort of core theme for the Architecture Biennial also for Uzbekistan this year. So I do urge you all to visit that if you haven't had a chance to go to Venice as of yet. But yes, these important sort of sites. And the artist hand becomes sort of really interesting in reimagining and rethinking these different cultural histories. And one of the great benefits of having this residency space is not only to rethink, but also to allow artists from different cultures to come and partake in that, thinking and reimagining, also sort of really critical. Thank you very much. I'd like to just bring the conversation, Shokhrukh.
Yep.
Hello, welcome. Shokhrukh Rakhimov, as I mentioned, is from a long legacy of ceramicists. His family, you are seventh generation. And I've had the privilege of visiting your family studio and partaking in some of the workshops that you also hold for intergenerational. And I wanted you to speak a little bit about your own sort of legacy, your family's history. You've sort of adapted to different cultural, sort of informed different types of cultural memory according to the sort of changes that have happened throughout Uzbekistan, given you're the seventh in a line of long family. Perhaps you could speak a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, as a Rahimov's dynasty, seventh generation, I would love to speak about our dynasty as a way how we're working, as a way how we're creating the pieces. And nowadays, the three of us were working together. It's my grandfather, Akbar Rahimov, my father, and me. And in Uzbekistan, we have really nice traditions where grandparents are teaching to the grandsons. And I really appreciate that as well. And my teacher is my grandfather, Akbar. And from my youngest age, I was surrounded actually with a craft, with a clay. And our studio was for me as a playground, but now I'm just creating the pieces. And for that, from my youngest age, my father, he taught me the way how we need to work with the clay and so on. And in general, nowadays, we're just continuing the works of my great-grandfather. We're just realigning our old techniques. On the same time, we're also creating new styles. Because of making the research and experiments is quite needed of all techniques. And we're going to help us this knowledge later on by creating new styles as well. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to help us such kind of residencies as, for example, Muhannad, who is coming to Uzbekistan, for example. We're just exchanging our knowledge. We're just creating new styles. By exchanging your ideas as well, later on in the future, you can create something interesting as well. So we just work on this way.
Yes, absolutely. It's very interesting. Obviously, there's been such a rich history of crafts and fine arts throughout Uzbekistan. The great Timur, the Timurid dynasty, he brought craftsmen from all over the Muslim world to build and to resurrect these beautiful monuments that that you see in Bukhara and Samarkand and elsewhere. And that was sort of really interesting that there was so much always respect given to artists. And we often talk about that. I've mentioned this before, that the Persian word for artist is honar mandar, which means artist in general. But in Uzbekistan, it means craftsman. So there's a really interesting sort of synergy there and respect given as well.
So we have a lot of artisans, the people who are working different types of craft here in Uzbekistan.
Yes.
And so nowadays, even we're working in our studio in more than 18 different styles and techniques. For example, it's a Timurid period of pottery, or a Samanid period of pottery in the 9th and 10th centuries. And so it's all within the help of experiments, which is creating all the pieces. And so we're just collaborating with an art historian, so with an archaeologist as well.
Yes.
Just finding all the findings and make some research on top of these pieces. And what's interesting, while we're traveling inside of Uzbekistan, in each region we have a unique styles. Because we're using all the local materials, local clay, colors, and glazes. So that's why when you go, for example, to Samarkand or Bukhara, you also see the different type of ceramics. That's why we're also traveling quite a lot inside of Uzbekistan.
Absolutely, yes. And in terms of, as CCA is going to be opening the Arts Centre, but you also have the residencies, how will you sort of see that changing the landscape as an artist who has this great legacy, and your studio has functioned as this sort of alternative arts hub? How do you sort of see CCA changing the landscape?
So within the help of this kind of possibilities of displaying the pieces, what we're creating in our studio in such kind of places, a center of contemporary art,
yes,
and meeting the worldwide audience in Uzbekistan, and seeing their kind of ideas about our pieces. And within the help of art residencies, which is exchanging our knowledge as well. And which really help us, because without exchanging our knowledge, without working in cooperation with other artists from all over the world, it's quite hard to create something interesting. And now our mission is to create a ceramic art for the 21st century. Because nowadays we have a team where it's period of pottery or Samanids, yeah. And then now it's time to create a 21st century ceramics.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I just want to sort of bring something back. You had mentioned, obviously, you're the 7th generation in your family, and you've sort of seen a lot of sort of change and adaptation. You've seen what was initially a craft now becoming a fully fledged career in Uzbekistan. Artists can work as a career. And I'd like to bring Gayane back into the conversation, because in October you launched the World Economic Cultural Forum, which was the first time it was held in Uzbekistan. And this was precisely to sort of fuse entrepreneurship and artistic production also together.
Yeah, because the craftsmanship, has been known in the country for centuries, but it was never really recognized as a job that can bring you income. It was always seen as just some people has that talent, they create people for the passion, but not really for the job. And I think it was really important for us also to give recognition to those people, but also to create some law around it. And we was introducing law at this conference last October. And for us, for our leadership, it was important that we create this law, we recognize these people, we give some tax incentives, and we create infrastructure around it, we create an ecosystem. And Shokhrukh, I think, was one of the key speakers also at this conference.
Yes, absolutely.
And his family.
Thank you, Gayane. I had the pleasure of visiting several times your family's studio, and I remember your grandfather telling me that during the Soviet period it was forbidden to have an artist studio, and that he had a small studio which was very small square footage. And he told me that this wasn't allowed, it wasn't seen as a profession in those days, and obviously it's changed so much. That's one of the initiated forums.
It changes so much, but also it gives a lot of recognition.
Absolutely.
And as you correctly say, when we say Hunarmand, we mean artist and artisan, which has to be equal, and that's what we are really dedicating our time and effort now to create this kind of linear between these two talents.
Absolutely. And so, Gayane, I wanted to sort of ask you, obviously, Center of Contemporary Arts is going to be the main artistic hub in Tashkent, but you've been working with the Bharbaniel sort of ideation for a number of years now, which is also about to open the same time within sort of a sequence to the Center of Contemporary Arts live opening. Could you share a little bit about that sort of idea of how you've sort of maintained the original sort of integrity, DNA of the buildings, and how art will help illuminate this ancient city?
Yeah, well, this idea was driven, as I said earlier, because of a lot of these architectural structures was abounded at that time. Mosque, madrasa, caravanserai, which used to be a part of Islamic architecture, a legacy, but at the same time it was also part of the Silk Road. So people was coming to the country at the time, to this land. They was exchanging goods at the caravanserais, and they was staying at the madrasa and praying at the mosque. So all of this ecosystem was existed then, and it was no longer in use. And of course, we get a lot of tourists that are coming to see this beautiful building, but what is inside of this building? And it was important for us to continue to create an art and infrastructure, and really to continue with the tourism. Because once Uzbekistan is one of those countries when you just tick the box and you never come back, because you've seen the Samarkand, you've seen Bukhara, and you have no reason basically to come back. But with all the infrastructures that we are creating, with the Bukhara Biennial, with the new museums that we're building, there is a reason to come back to the country at least every now and again. And this is why it's also important for us also to integrate in the creative economy, because this is for the younger generation. You correctly said that the economy is booming. There is a younger generation that we have to invest in, and this is how we see the culture can emerge.
Yes, and you're also involved in a number of initiatives in Samarkand to designate buildings as heritage sites. Could you share a little bit about that as well?
You mean in
UNESCO?
In UNESCO?
Yes.
So we are currently working on a very, very large project. So we've been able to identify 21 buildings in Tashkent as part of Tashkent modernism, Soviet modernism, which dated from 65 to 85. And while we was archiving all of those buildings, it came to our minds that we can actually bring these buildings to the UNESCO list of heritage, because Tashkent is presumably too young to be in UNESCO, because all of the buildings we inherited from the past, they're not really allied to be included in UNESCO, apart from Samarkand, Khiva, and Bukhara as a historical sites. So we, from this year, from the end of the year, we're including 11 buildings to UNESCO cultural sites from the Tashkent modernism. And I think this is a big moment for the Tashkent, because if not those buildings, we would never able, to be as part of the listed buildings for this region, for the Tashkent. And it's quite exciting. This year we brought it to Venice, one of the sites that also Muhannad is working on, and it's just a privilege, to see how this building from 70s can really tell the stories today and can still be seen as a contemporary pieces.
Yes, absolutely. And by inviting artists into these sort of architectural spaces and adding their perspective, adding their eyes, their hands, their lens, it's sort of really exciting to see how they're interpreting that. And there are a number of young artists in the Architecture Biennale in Venice as well who have reinterpreted some of these stories.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they reinterpreted the story, but there also was a residence of the art residence which existed today as a building, because of all of these artists that was working with us in Venice. They was actually part of creative labs that we created had ago, when we was just working on those buildings, and I was really privileged to see how throughout these 3 years, they developed themselves as progressive artists.
Absolutely. And with the Center of Contemporary Arts being part of the suite of modernist buildings in Tashkent, we feel really fortunate that we'll be able to sort of expand the conversation. And one of the sort of programs that we will be initiating with CCA is to sort of reimagine and rethink what was happening in very recent history of the 20th century, where Tashkent used to be a center for the global south, for the global majority. And there were people coming, artists, filmmakers, thinkers coming from Latin America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent to Tashkent. So it was a sort of site for soft power in the 20th century. As early as the sort of 1930s to the 50s, there was an Afro-Asia conference for writers. And literary figures such as Du Bois, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, all had come through Tashkent. It was a sort of very important cultural magnet. And then for 30 years, there was a very major film festival for the Global South. Also, it sort of ran from the 60s through to the 80s. And much of the work that we'll be doing at CCA is to sort of bring together this juncture and think about how 2/3 of the world was sort of meeting in Tashkent, how it was sort of cultural center. And what does that look like in the 21st century when we have this very young population, when we have literally this center which is at the literal crossroads of the world. You have China, India, the Middle East. It's all sort of within relevant sort of distance, if you like. You know, not walking distance, of course, but it's definitely distance that is very, the proximity is very close. So a lot of the work that we'll be doing at the CCA is going to be resurrecting these ties, bringing together sort of intelligentsia, cultural workers, artists from the global south. And it's not something that we've invented. You know, there is already that sort of legacy, if you think about all the way in the ancient times from the Silk Road to more recent 20th century. So we're very excited, and the programming will reveal itself to sort of highlight that also. So I'm very much looking forward to welcoming you all. As we're coming to the closing sort of point, I'd just like to ask our fellow panel members if they wanted to sort of add anything regarding transformation or adapting spaces and its sort of relevance to public space and public time. Because, you know, the public is a core component of how these buildings function. Sort of we're using them, they're our main sort of point of employment. We work there, we sort of interact with them. But how does the general public fit into this puzzle? Shokhrukh?
In Uzbekistan, we have this kind of place like in a mahallas. In each mahalla, we have this kind of small centers where people can meet each other. And for example, the art residencies now we have in Old Town in Tashkent. So it's also located in mahalla. And there's a community of people, 200, 300 people who are living all together. And for example, is the young generations, they simply can learn a little bit about art. And for example, in our studio as well, we're just inviting from 6 to 12 years old, boys and girls. Once a week, they came to our studio, we're working with them together. And our main mission is to show them what actually art is. And there's no need for them to become an artist later on in the future. The main thing is they will start to appreciate it and start to creatively think as well. Because of the same level, the education has a creativity as well. That's why we need to work on the creativity of the people as well. And so nowadays, also within a half of such kind of art residencies, we're just showing the people, our local people, the future of the art.
Thank you so much. Muhannad?
I mean, you know, growing up in Saudi, we kind of existed under a singular mono-narrative, a singular monolith, a way of seeing. And what's happening right now, which is very architectural, which is the idea of the single block being fragmented into the multitude, you know, reflecting visions of change and the imagination into the eyes of the collective. It is no longer about singular ways of seeing, singular ways of imagining, but rather this coming together of the public, of repurposing of space, allowing for the imagination to take shape, to escape the mind and transform the world. And this can't happen through a singular approach. It requires these infinite possibilities, infinite building blocks of the imagination. And I see that very much being echoed both in Saudi through the young generation that is now collectively seeing, and also in Uzbekistan.
And you've sort of witnessed that with this very young population, the curiosity. Absolutely, good. And Gayane, I know you often refer to yourself as a public servant, that your first role is to serve the public of Uzbekistan and then the region and the globe, also through your cultural sort of heritage plans and so forth. Maybe you want to close the discussion with a few words.
Well, I just wanted to basically answer your question, maybe. So coming back to Shokhrukh said something very beautiful. You know, we have all settled in mahallas, and I think it was important when we were thinking of every site-specific space that we create, you know, that they're site-specific for this region, and this region has a history and we can evolve, you know, and when we're talking the art residency, and Muhammad was just staying there, you know, as an art residency, I think it was important for us to build it inside of the old mahallas where people are still live and people can share their culture, and I think it's really great to live with the people around you. And you know, to learn about the country through the cultures and through the people, and not just through the practitioners. And I think this is the beauty of the Uzbekistan that we can still share, you know. The people are still around those buildings. And if just to evolve, I just saw on the screen the building which we are currently creating with Tadawando, the National Museum of Uzbekistan. And I think it's also quite important that we create this new infrastructure for the new exhibitions to arise in Uzbekistan. But I got this random question yesterday, why don't you bring Modigliani or Monet to Uzbekistan? And I think once we build a beautiful museum, once it will be relevant, then of course all of this beautiful art from the outside world will be emerging in Uzbekistan. But I think for now it's really important for us to work on our culture inside the country and really to bring it abroad.
Absolutely, and this new museum, it's important to say CCA is non-collecting institution, but the Tadao Ando Design Museum, which is in the forthcoming future, will be housing the national collection, but also you're acquiring work also.
Of course, yeah, of the international artists, contemporary artists as well, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. If there are any questions, please, otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you.